Hello everyone, and welcome to the second iDRAMA seminar talk. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Megan Squire. Megan is a professor of computer science at Elon University, and she's doing some very interesting and important research on understanding niche and extremist online communities, and in particular radical right-wing groups on social media. And I'm very looking forward to the talk. So Megan, please take it right away.
All right, thanks, Savas. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. We're going to talk about fundraising today. So clandestine groups that are making money and giving money and don't want us to know about it. We use a data science approach. So messy data at the beginning from all kinds of different places, using computer models and statistical techniques and so forth to sort and arrange that data ultimately so we can present it visually or in a way that folks can learn patterns. So understanding something about the world that we didn't know before we started, right? So I'll present 3 ideas today. 2 of them are finance specific, and then 1 is a bridge between 2 types of financing. So it's sort of a bridge idea that we had to get through in order to get to the 3rd one. So we'll start with some questions about why we study finances online. So the questions that I'm interested in using data science to figure out are how bad actors earn money online, whether that differs by format. So if they're asking for donations versus selling things like e-commerce, some of the technical features of the different platforms, the online platforms that they're using. Do these features encourage financial exploitation? And if so, how, and which platforms and which features? And then I'm very interested in the next generation of fundraising techniques. So when we get to the end, I'll sort of tell the story of far-right fundraising as we go through, but the end is where the interesting stuff is to me. So yeah, so let's start with a simple project. This one's kind of old school. It did get some attention, but not at the time that I did it. It was much later that this finally got some attention. But let me talk about an old school study of far-right extremist financing. So you might be familiar with this group. This is the Proud Boys. They're kind of a far-right street fighting gang, I guess, in the US. They do have a uniform, they have a hierarchy, they have leaders and followers and statewide leaders and things like that. So in that sense, they're a pretty typical, what we might call a traditional organizational paradigm. So leaders, followers, they pay dues, things like that. And so I was interested in mapping out the hierarchy of this group. I had been studying them on Facebook for several years and knew that they did have some kind of hierarchy, although as a clandestine group, it is sometimes hard to discern what that hierarchy is. So someone tipped me off that they were using Venmo to pay their dues. And I thought, okay, well, that's an interesting data source. Venmo is public by default. So that means all of the user accounts and the transactions are public. Not the amount of money that's transferred, but the fact that the money is transferred is public by default. So it's an interesting data set in that way. I did find numerous Proud Boys, about a little over 200, that were using Venmo to pay dues and do other things. Like you can see an example here in the middle where they were renting buses to travel across state lines to engage protesters in fights, street fights. And so I set about collecting the payments between Proud Boys on Venmo platform to see if I could build a map of what the network might look like. And then I was going to compare that to the Facebook network that I'd already built. So here's a map of what the Venmo Proud Boys payment structure looks like. So each circle, each node is a person. And the edges, they're connected by whether they paid each other money at some point for Proud Boys related expenses. So I didn't include if it was like paying rent or, electricity or something like that. But if they were out paying dues or going to an event or buying t-shirts or something like that, or if it included like the Proud Boys slogan or whatever, then I included the payment. So it's about 200 Proud Boys, and I forget how many payments, but it was many hundreds, probably 1,000, I don't really remember. My model shows the circles larger, the more payments they engaged in. So the degree of the node is how they're sized here. And then I colorized the ones in red that my model predicted would be the leaders of the group. So on the simple hypothesis that in this organization, if you're taking dues, especially over a long period of time from a lot of people, you're likely to be in a position of leadership, whether that's a treasurer of a group or the leader, the president of the chapter or whatever. So that's kind of cool. I mean, it's kind of interesting, right? Like, oh, there's some red circles, but the question is, how do I know if I'm right? So how do I know if those circles are actually the leaders? So this is a secret group. They don't go around advertising that, except one time that they did. So in 2018, they put out a new constitution and a bylaws document where they named their new leaders. So the original leader, Gavin McInnes, the guy who started the group, stepped aside, legal reasons, blah, blah, blah. And they named 8 sort of capos, sub leaders that were going to be they were going to take over for him. And they called this the elders chapter. And then they put out their new bylaws laying all this out. They listed the 8 members of the elders chapter, but they redacted the names in the PDF file that they put out, except that they didn't do a very good job of redacting the names. So anyone could just take their mouse and hover over. So I was very excited when I saw this because I have a model with some predicted leaders, and now I have the actual leaders that were chosen to lead the group, so I can compare, right, and just determine if my model was correct. So let's see how I did. Right off the bat, 4 of the circles on my diagram, 4 of my chosen nodes, were indeed chosen to be leaders of Proud Boys. So we have up here in the upper sort of middle right, we have the Northeast chapter, so Boston in the US, Connecticut, Rhode Island. And down here we had a Georgia-based leader, so the state of Georgia, and then over here we have the Pacific Northwest leader and the California leader. Both of those were also chosen to be elders, so Proud Boys leaders. And I had predicted them already just based on the number of payments they were processing and their status in some of the Facebook groups. There were 3 additional leaders here in the center that I declared to be leaders, but they weren't actually named as elders. They were, however, some of the oldest members of the group as a whole. This is the New York chapter, which was the original Proud Boys chapter. And so these were folks who had built up a lot of social capital, had attended a lot of events, and were kind of like central players, although they were not named as elders. Probably because they were in the New York chapter, and that is also the chapter where the original founder is. So I guess he gets to be the leader of that chapter. Anyway, up here I had 2 leaders that I predicted, but I was not able to confirm that they were on the elders list because on Venmo they used a fake name. So most people use their real name on Venmo, probably because it has to do with money, and they're worried that if they don't use their real name, something could go wrong, right? Which makes it a nice data source. But unfortunately, this guy, or these 2 guys, I think it's one, but anyway, these 2 accounts used a fake name. And so although it was obvious that they were in Texas, I was not able to determine they were really from the Texas cell. And then there was one guy that my model never would have predicted was a leader, and yet this guy was named as one of the elders. So kind of a mystery there. Maybe he has other skills other than collecting money, so maybe he's a web developer or something like that, but I did not predict that person would be a leader. So kind of interesting. I guess what we take away from this is that you can use the exhaust fumes of a data source, so throw away data on Venmo, to sort of reverse engineer the structure of an organization via the payments, the relationship between people, and then hopefully you're able to confirm that with some real world data. Yeah, I got a little bit lucky there being able to find that, that bylaws document to confirm. So this is an old school organization. It's collecting dues kind of the old fashioned way. It's doing a lot of traditional payments between people. Nothing really pushing the envelope as far as technology or anything like that. But we need to transition to talking about propaganda a little bit, because the newer methods of making money and swapping money between people don't work as much anymore like Venmo. For one thing, groups are sort of fading away, and individuals and brands are on the upswing. This may be a pendulum swing, you know, back and forth, a temporary change, but at least that's what I'm noticing right now. So in order to get to how fundraising and financing happens now, we have to take a brief detour into propaganda and understand how that works right now online. So brief detour and then back to funding. So the questions here, we need to understand how propaganda spreads online in far-right extremist groups. We need to understand whether that too differs by format. So text propaganda like books, manifestos versus video, streaming, audio propaganda like podcasts. And then the technical features, again, of each platform that encourage or allow propaganda to be spread on those platforms. And then hopefully eventually be able to determine maybe some strategies for stopping that spread. But the first thing is to understand what the landscape actually looks like. So to study this, I looked at far-right extremist podcasts over a period of 15 years, 18 different shows, over 4,000 episodes of podcasts, and about 900 different cast members of those podcasts, so hosts and guests. And I built this data set manually, so it was really hard. It was a big data set for something to be built manually, but other than the data was not easy to get programmatically, and it came from a lot of different sources. So there's a lot of cleaning and things like that. What you see on the screen is the cast, the main cast of one of the Extremist podcasts. This one's called The Daily Show. He's wearing a shirt from Fashion the Nation, which is another podcast, but that one's also in my data set, but these guys aren't actually on that one. So the podcasts are then organized into networks. So there's some that are kind of run by the same company, as it were. So I wanted to map out this landscape and see what was going on with it and how it had grown and changed over time, how they had learned to use money and fundraising to keep themselves afloat, right? And then how that's going to translate into the next phase of extremist fundraising. So I built a network, again, just to get a sense of the landscape, as it were. So what you're going to see now is a video. Hopefully this will play. It's only 11 seconds. It's really slow, and I'll probably play it a couple times. And then we'll talk about the different pieces of the network in a minute. So this is the network as it started in 2005. And you can slowly see some of the characters branching out and starting their own podcasts, at which point in 2014 and 2015, 2016, the network kind of explodes. I'm going to show that again. So again, 2005, and then slow growth into 2009, 10, and there's 14, and then 16, 17. So it ends in 2020. Most of the infrastructure by then has already been set up. So let's look at some of the players and some of the things we learned about how propaganda spreads from building this network. So as I mentioned, the network starts in 2005. It actually started with a show called The Political Cesspool, which is up here shown in blue. The nodes here are people, and the people are connected by whether they've appeared on an episode together. So this guy in the center, the big blueberry, he's the host of the show. So obviously his circle is the biggest because he's been on the most programs. And then you've got his frequent co-hosts here kind of in a circle around him. And then you can start to see some branch out characters. So in the paper for this one, I highlighted 3 of the personalities that were probably the most well-known, or I guess started on the show, but went off to do their own thing. So one of those is Richard Spencer. He's notable in this case because he didn't rise to prominence in the US for his propaganda about the alt-right, the quote unquote alt-right. He popularized that term, invented that term, but he didn't get popular for that until about 2016 when he finally reached the mainstream news cycles. He first mentioned that term, though, and started floating propaganda about the quote unquote alt-right back in 2009. So this screenshot here shows Richard Spencer's first appearance on The Political Cesspool back in 2009. So he basically had 7 years to appear on this podcast numerous times, dozens of times, floating his ideas, refining the ideas, getting feedback from callers, chatting about it with other co-hosts, and really just refining and building that brand, which eventually would become the alt-right that we know about in 2016. The Right Stuff is another show that sort of branched off from this original podcast idea, the idea of a right-wing podcast. So this started in 2014. It was fairly small. They called the host and guests the death panel. So you can see the collection of folks appearing on the death panel starts off really small, but then grows to be pretty substantial. It's sort of this orange junk here in the center. And they actually started their own network after the success of the first show. And so, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 of the shows on here are actually underneath that network. We can apply a neighborhood finding algorithm within Gephi. I just use the defaults here, but to find some of the networks there. And you can see that they do reflect the actual podcast network. So all of this orange up here, all of that, it becomes the right stuff, which is that network that was founded by the Daily Show guys. You can see some other networks here too that are kind of interesting, or sub-networks, neighborhoods. Over here is a Nordic podcast. It's an English language outreach podcast. So it's called Nordic Frontier. And although the hosts and stuff are all in Finland and Sweden and so forth, the podcast is conducted in English and serves as outreach to English-speaking parts of the world, especially the United States. And there's a lot of crossover between the hosts and guests transatlantically. There's some other podcasts that didn't quite make the melting pot. So this one over here sort of never did quite fit in. Had a little bit of crossover, but not much. And then down here was a collection of podcasts. It's kind of interesting that the neighborhood finding algorithm put them together. At first I was confused by that. And then I realized that one of them was a women's podcast and the other one was a fascist podcast. And I'm pretty sure there was like a marriage in there somewhere. Someone was dating someone else that was on the show. So that's what pulled them closer together on the diagram. I would not have guessed that those two would be that close together, but anyway. So we see over 15 years, the ecosystem of podcasting, so this audio-based propaganda and the host and guest ecosystem there built up over time, slowly. Each of the shows shown on here was using traditional fundraising methods. So the blue show up here uses advertising, old school radio advertising. The shows down here in the orange section, sort of the more modern shows, take donations via, well, originally they took donations via credit card, but now they take those via cryptocurrency. So it's really kind of an old school fundraising method, but layered on top of this newer method of producing and distributing propaganda digitally. So the podcast ecosystem is going to serve as a bridge to what we're going to talk about next. So the next thing that I'm studying, and this one's taken up the past year of my life, probably will continue because it's a big thing, at least to me, is the idea of taking the propaganda, so the audio and video streams, and then making money from those directly. So rather than recording yourself and then asking for donations later or getting money for a canned stream that's already been recorded, what if you could layer the fundraising directly on top of the propaganda? So this is the phase we're in right now. Okay, so instead of the audio podcast being recorded and you pay for a subscription, now you're going to ask for donations during the stream live. So to study this question, I've turned to a platform called DLive. This is a video game streaming platform. So you can see here, there's different video games. People can be playing those games and then other folks watch them. And if you like what you see or the person's funny or interesting in some way, you can give them a donation. There's a site currency called Lemons that you give the donations in, and you can buy into those currencies with real dollars or real euros or whatever you have. So the cool thing about this platform is that the data is available. So this is an example of the screen from inside the program. So this is a person here called Pete Santilli, and he's streaming with his co-host here. And they have this very busy screen, so I'll walk through some of it with you. But over here on the right-hand side, you see the chat. Up here on the top, you can see some donations that were being given for that during that stream. Down here on the middle bottom, you can see the different bundles of currency. So if you feel like giving a donation in a particular size, you can do that. And then right down here where I don't know if you can see my mouse pointer, but right down here on the sort of tabs, there used to be a tab there called earnings, and you could see a leaderboard, or not a leaderboard, but a ledger of all of that person's earnings on the site. So this was a really nice data source because all of that data is available publicly via their API. So I wrote some code to collect that data for a collection of folks. So let's talk about the data set. One of the folks that I collected was this guy here, Nick Fuentes. He's shown here with a pumpkin because I screen capped this back in October. So I guess he was talking about Halloween or something like that. But he was one of the first donors that I really, attracted me to this platform because he was making so much money, as evidenced by the high placement on the leaderboard for his performance and the amount of earnings and funds that were coming in. So he was the first person that I looked at, but I quickly expanded the data set so that I could answer how much money was really changing hands on this platform. I was curious about whether donations were timed with streaming activities. So one thing about DLive is they allow you to take donations 24 hours a day, even when you're not streaming. This is a little bit different than, say, YouTube Super Chats, which you can they're tied to the stream. So I was curious about that. I was interested in what behaviors donors exhibit. So like, are they mostly like mega donors or they're tiny ones? How do they treat the platform? Like just what can I learn about their behaviors from this data? And then of course, I love the network. So building out a network of the donors and streamers just to see what it looks like, and are there clusters, or is it just kind of a big mess and everybody's donating to everyone else? So again, I took this screenshot here just to show you where the data is that I was able to pull. So this is just showing the top contributors for this stream, but underneath inside this API, you can get the data for all of the transaction ledger for each streamer or donor, each person on the platform. So I did that. I just wrote some code to grab out that API data. And what I built was a data set of 20 different donors, so mega donors, 44 streamers, so people that were streaming. They had to be in one of the far right extremist categories as defined by Southern Poverty Law Center, so anti-government, militias, white supremacist types, Proud Boys, that kind of thing. And then 55 other people of interest who were basically known. They were kind of like streamers who hadn't started streaming yet. They're known people who were either in the podcast data set or were known to be YouTube streamers in this category, but just hadn't started making money on the platform yet. So I went ahead and grabbed them too, just to see what their behavior was like. The data that was available in the transaction ledger is cash in and cash out, donation in and out, and then the relationships between people. So this is like who's following who. So again, cash in is cash coming into the system. You can imagine this would be very high for donors, maybe less high for streamers, but cash out is very high for streamers because they're the recipient of the donations, right? Donations in and out is just of the amount I cashed in, where did I send my donations? And then donations out is similar. It's, donations out is where did I send my donations? Donations in is who's giving me money. I should probably make a graphic for that. Anyway, next time I do this talk, I'll have a graphic for that. So here's an example of what we can learn. This is Nick Fuentes' earnings. This is his donation trail, inbound donations to him over time. So we have dollars on Y, and then we have time on X, and we can see each day, he gets a certain number of donations. The taller the spike happens to coincide with the days that he's streaming. So right there, we answer one of the questions. Do the donations line up with when they stream? Yes, they do. There aren't a whole lot of people giving donations on off days, right? So if the guy takes the day off and you give him a donation anyway, that's pretty rare. In fact, the data is so periodic that you can see the weekends in the data. So there's 5 days of streaming and a weekend, 5 days of streaming and a weekend, 5 days of streaming and a weekend, 5 days of, like it's pretty regularized here, especially weekday weekends. Where the data starts getting interesting is right around in here. It starts to get a little bit more sporadic. We lose the weekends. There's a lot of special purpose streaming and off-day streaming. What's going on there is the US election. So the US election was here. These were some of the largest inbound donation days that Nick had on the platform. And he takes a few days off to kind of regroup and then starts holding daily streams. Some of these are in real world locations. So he's not streaming anymore behind the green screen in the basement. Now he's out on the street live streaming real world events associated with the Stop the Steal movement. And so we can actually see the days when he's at a Stop the Steal event and how much money is coming in, as well as just back to the green screen discussion of news events and so on. Takes a couple of days off around the Christmas time. And then on the 4th of January, he's back with a big donation day. Here's the 6th. He did not live stream that day, but did live stream the day after, talking about the event and calling it a great success. So we can track pretty closely someone's earnings, as well as trying to learn some of the questions that we didn't know, such as how the donations are, how the donors decide to give. And it turns out to be pretty tightly tied to the streaming schedule. We can then build a network and start to see some of the relationships here. So what you see on the screen is a social network of donors and streamers. The donors are gray and the streamers are pink. And a couple things pop out immediately. I've labeled some of the clusters to talk about them individually in the papers that I wrote and stuff, but a couple things pop out almost immediately. There's, oh, and I should mention before I talk, this is only donors who've given at least $120. So that's 10,000 lemons in the site currency. There was just too much data to show smaller ones there. It just looks like a big hairball. So I teased out just the high donors. But you can see some clusters emerging. So like up here is a Proud Boys cluster. They're pretty loosely tied to the rest of the network. So, not very strong. Here you see that guy that I showed you earlier, the Pete Santilli show. His, again, pretty big cluster, but it's not super well tied to the rest of the network. This is the Nick Fuentes America First cluster, and we'll talk more about them in a minute. Lots of money changing hands. It's a much tighter cluster. There's more characters involved, more streamers that are kind of involved in that. And some of the fattest lines here, the big donations, you can see are coming into that cluster. And then there's like a couple standalone ones. This one is particularly interesting. This is the Martin Sellner cluster. He's a German language streamer from Austria who's been tied to the Christchurch shooter. The Christchurch shooter sent him money. So anyway, that's an interesting cluster because it's really not connected to the rest of the network, probably because of the language differences. I did apply a network finding algorithm here, and it pretty much just shows what we already knew, that there's these kind of standalone clusters, and then there's a big muddy middle of sort of YouTube, I don't know what to call YouTube shit poster accounts, I guess. These are just kind of, not super strong brands, but people who used to be on YouTube got kicked off and then came over to this platform. And then we do see the America First cluster here kind of showing up. A couple things about the donors. So I was interested in their behavior, as I mentioned. Here's one of the donors. He goes by Geo949. He's recently changed his name on the platform. I forget what the new name is. It's some kind of letters and numbers. But anyway, he gave about $21,000, $22,000 on the platform during the period that I studied it, which was, by the way, I didn't mention that, but it's April 2020 to beginning of March 2021. 96% of Geo's donations were made on the mobile platform as opposed to on the browser, which I thought was an interesting point. I'll talk more about in a minute. Another big mega donor was T-Based. He was the largest of the donors that I found in this data set. He gave $90,000 over that period of about 10 months to these streamers. 100% was browser-based purchasing of lemons. You can see his cluster. I showed his ego graph here. So he is donating a lot of money. His fattest lines are kind of up here into the America First cluster. And then one interesting donor is Doomer Squidward. He gave about $45,000. I want to say 40 plus thousand of that came in the last month between the election and the insurrection. And a lot of that was actually donated back by the platform. So we're able to see cash outs that take place in the form of refunds. He was actually refunded a lot of that money after many of these streamers were kicked off of the platform for their participation and build up around the insurrection. 94% of his purchases were done on a mobile device. So let's talk about the donors a little bit more. You can see their usernames are kind of, I mean, it's not easy to tell who they are, and that's fine. So I don't have a lot about their demographics or who they are, where they come from or anything like that. So I'll tell you what I was able to find out about them, just so we can get a sense of who's donating in. One of the big questions that I get is this money laundering or some foreign government propping these guys up? And I can say with confidence that at least in the cases that I looked at, that is not the case. These are just rich people with very poor taste in fundraising or funding. But you can see here the amount of dollars that they've cashed into the platform. And I just sorted these high to low by dollars amount in. And then I was interested in the question about browser versus mobile, because there is a price difference between purchasing lemons on the browser versus purchasing on the mobile device. It's about, it's a fraction of a cent higher, but with these kind of dollar amounts, I was curious if they would try to maximize their unit price, be good consumers and try to get the best bang for their buck. And it turned out that in a lot of cases, some of the highest donors, the ones putting the most money into the system, really did not care. They were not, trying to maximize the value of their dollar. And in many cases weren't even purchasing the largest bundle possible in order to get the best price. Looked like a lot of impulse buying. And I just thought that was really interesting. I don't think we've seen that kind of data anywhere else. So sort of an insight into the psyche of some of these donors. Other things we can learn are about some of the interpersonal relationships between the streamers. So here I show two ego graphs, one of the America Firsters called Jaden McNeil. This is his ego graph. He's receiving money in from this guy and other people too, but interestingly not from Nick, who's the sort of leader of America First. Similarly, we can look at Nick's ego graph and we notice that he's not receiving donations in from Jaden, but is receiving them in from other folks. And I point that out because if you have the unfortunate, I guess, if your life is unfortunate and you follow these people as closely as I do, you'll know that Nick and Jaden are kind of best friends, and they constantly promote each other's work and each other's shows and are showing up at real world events together constantly. And yet they don't seem to donate money to one another. And so there may be something going on where the idea of taking donations is tied to a social ranking, a social hierarchy. In fact, the person on the screen that donated to both of them, but they didn't donate to him, was Patrick. And he's recently been pushed out of the group and is sort of on the outs from the entire group here. Some of that has to do with the relationship to the donor T-based, whose jealousy over who was giving more money and so forth, but and who he was giving money to on the platform. But there is potentially some interesting things you could learn about interpersonal relationships and the idea of what is the social purpose of donating, aside from just giving money. When you already have enough money and now you're donating for show, what does that tell us? So kind of interesting. Other open questions that we can use the data set to study, which I haven't done yet, but I plan to, or maybe someone else will beat me to it, which is fine, is understanding the relationship between what the donor or the streamer is saying versus what the donors are giving. So is there a tuning knob where the more heated the rhetoric, let's say, or the more toxic the rhetoric, do we see an ensuing uptick in donations? So those impulse types of donations. I don't have a good example of a screenshot showing this, so I just grabbed one from this morning. This is like literally a screenshot from today. You can see the date, but he's talking about a new platform that is being invented by the founder of the MyPillow company or whatever. Anyway, and so this guy during the stream gave two ninja guineas, they're called, which is this 2,000 lemons, I guess. And so you can see that it would be fairly easy to line up the transcript of the broadcast against the donations and just look for times when the rhetoric was heated or not heated, or just other things that may be driving the donations. I think that would be extremely interesting and would probably help us answer questions about what these platforms are, how are they serving to really let these guys exploit them for propaganda purposes. So anyway, kind of an interesting idea. Yeah, so that's all I've got. And I would love to hear comments or questions, ideas for future study, etc. A lot of my work ends up being very preliminary, I guess. So the things that I showed here are very simple designs, but they're intended to answer specific questions that we didn't know about some of the right-wing groups. So if you have more sophisticated analyses, I'd love to hear about them, or ideas for where to get more interesting data. Always want to hear those too. So thanks so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So cool.
Okay, thanks, Megan, for the very interesting talk.
Sure.
And if people have questions, feel free to either, write on the chat or.
Yeah, I can watch the chat, or you can just call out. Tell me what
or unmute. Let me stop the recording.